Hello, this is Rudy Giuliani, and I'm back with another episode of Rudy's Common Sense. This episode is going to be entitled Protest or Revolution, or maybe Protest or Revolution. So China is undergoing mass protests. There's no question about that. And they're pretty recent, unlike the ones in Iran, which we're going to speak about in a moment, which go back about 2.5 months. The protests broke out, as is usual, as they did in Iran, with a proximate cause. You know, protests in a country as suppressed as China could break out anytime. Just a little history, brief history. But the Chinese people between Mao up to Xi are living under certainly the most homicidal dictatorship in the world. The combination of Chinese communist dictators has killed about 60 to 80 million Chinese. Not only the minorities and the who are slated for genocide, but just regular Chinese people who disagree in any respect with the totalitarian Chinese regime, or let's say the policy of killing young girls, or just the taking of land anytime they want, or the movement of people to parts of the country that they don't want to live, or now, what has really caused it is the COVID policy, largely adopted by Fauci, if you think about it, because Fauci was extremely close to China, to the point where he once made the extraordinary statement he didn't think the Chinese would be responsible for spreading the COVID virus because they might kill their own people. Of course, either naive or much worse than that. China is the country where you could surely say there'd be no concern about killing their own people. So all of a sudden, last week, I believe it was on a Friday, Friday, in a remote province of China, a building caught on fire, and 10 people were killed, and a number wounded. Now, let me show you on a map. There's the map of China. So now you get oriented to China. Now we'll take a look at where this took place. We'll circle both Beijing, which you know is the capital of China, and then we will circle Urumqi, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is in the remote region of Xinjiang. And I believe it's the capital of Xinjiang. And it's here that the building caught fire and on Friday, and 10 people died. Beijing, of course, is near the ocean, near the Pacific Ocean, not far from it, or the South China Sea, or whatever it's called right there. But then very much inland and moving really toward, and not far from the Mongolian and Russian borders of China, is the city of Urumqi. There it is, Urumqi, which is in the province of Xinjiang. And fire broke out in a building, 10 people died. And the people said that the delay in the fire rescue getting there, and maybe the fire itself, was a direct cause of the deaths. And it was directly caused by Xi's zero tolerance lockdown policy, which they are once again undergoing, and really have had, if they've had relief from it in the last 2.5 years, it's only been very, very sporadic. They've basically been locked down, you know, pretty much what the Democrat governors wanted to do until there was so much protest, just lock you down. When I say that this movement toward authoritarianism and bossing you around and telling you what to do inheres in Marxism, and of course it isn't at the same degree in the United States, You look at the similar battles in the United States between those who believe we should have been locked down and those who believe that we shouldn't. And you can see among those who believe we should be locked down a real affinity for socialism, certainly, communism, probably. And here is a perfect example of the most communist nation in the world, really now getting itself in trouble with a population that it has completely subjugated by locking down that whole vast country. Beijing has a university called the Tsinghua University, and there's been a 3-year lockdown of that university since the virus was discovered in Wuhan. Now, let's take a look at where Wuhan is so you get an idea of how far apart these are. So Wuhan now is in the south. Now we will take a short break. To accomplish things like this, to accomplish what we accomplished in protecting human life with the Supreme Court decision last year and so many of other things that are happening against the weight of this express train toward communism and socialism, Patriot Mobile is there for you. I mean, Patriot Mobile is Patriot Mobile is a service that you can use for your cell phone, for your laptops, for your devices. I mean, it takes the place of all those big names, just as effective, just as widespread, much, much better deals, much, much better deals, much better. And let me see, we're just going to check on that. Those deals are still going. Those deals are still going. It's time for gifts, by the way. This might be a nice gift for people at Christmas time. And here's what you're doing with Patriot Mobile. It's the only Christian conservative phone provider. And what that means is, on one side, the altruistic side, you'll be helping the causes that you believe in like they believe in. Okay? And on the other side, you will be able to get really, really good bargains, particularly given the economic stress that Americans are under. So I would ask you, particularly also for those of you who are veterans and for those of you who are first responders, there'll be special discounts and special bonuses. So go to patriotmobile.com/Rudy. That's patriotmobile.com/Rudy. And see what Patriot Mobile can do for you. Just give it a check, because you might work out a great deal, and then along with the great deal, you'll be helping the causes you believe in most. Thank you for returning. Then protests just spread out all over the country, which is really very, very strange, and I would think very upsetting to the regime, because it's a big country. It's very spread apart. News doesn't travel that quickly, although I guess it does now, huh? And I'm going to try to trace for you just how it spread. I mean, and within 3 days, right? In 3 days, it spread. So it begins in Urumqi, right? And there, the night of the original protests, they were singing the Chinese national anthem, but they added their own lyrics to it. Let me read the lyrics they added to it. Rise up, those who refuse to be slaves. And they shouted they wanted to be released from lockdowns. This was sung on the evening of the fire. They killed 10 people, by the way. Which led to the accusations that the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, which is very much identified with the dictator Xi, who has now made himself basically president for life. Shortly thereafter, protesters gathered on the Urumqi Road, which was named after the Xinjiang capital, Urumqi, and they continued that on Saturday and Sunday. And that's the Urumqi Road. It's basically right there. It's right there it's basically right here. We'll just put a little red line. Probably not that big. It's basically right there. So on Saturday and Sunday night, it expanded now to something very extraordinary for China. The protesters in Urumqi and in Xinjiang, who made it to that 2-evening protest at the Urumqi Road.
The largest protests since Tiananmen Square in 1989 are rocking China as tens of thousands of demonstrators across the country fill the streets this weekend to denounce Beijing's strict quarantine and testing policies known as zero COVID. But some of the demonstrations quickly evolved into demands for political change, including the removal of President Xi Jinping himself. Nick Schifrin begins our coverage.
In the southwestern city of Chengdu, protesters demand freedom. Freedom of press, they chant, freedom of speech. In the central city of Wuhan, where COVID began, they break down the fence that kept them quarantined. And in the western city of Urumqi, they fly the flag and demand the end of lockdowns. Nationwide protests. Lit by a literal fire in Urumqi last week. Witnesses say a COVID lockdown trapped residents in a burning building and killed at least 10. But this is a national release of pent-up anger. They're furious with zero COVID and its brutal enforcement, which continued this weekend on a BBC reporter in Shanghai. There, in China's largest city, the protests got personal. Step down Xi Jinping, they chant, one of the few times in years that demonstrators used his name. The protests spread to the capital Beijing, including to Tsinghua University, one of the country's most famous campuses. Those who didn't want to make it explicit didn't have to. A blank piece of paper, or an equation by physicist Alexander Freeman, as in free man, which many protesters no longer are.
In Shanghai, a lot of people have already been detained. They did it for everybody, for all the people. Free those people in Shanghai.
In Washington today, National Security Spokesman John Kirby endorsed Chinese citizens' right to peaceful protest.
The lockdown is not a policy that we support here. But obviously there are people in China that have concerns about that, and they're protesting that, and we believe they should be able to do that peacefully.
Beijing maintains the world's strictest COVID controls. Hundreds of millions of people must submit to daily tests and quarantine for extended periods. Recently, China relaxed some rules and shortened quarantines for close contacts of COVID patients and for foreign visitors, eliminated contact tracing for secondary contacts, and phased out routine mass testing in several cities. Today, Beijing City announced it would further ease some quarantine rules, and Guangzhou reduce mass testing. But today, Chinese authorities defended zero COVID and denied that national unrest threatened the policy.
China has been following the dynamic zero COVID policy and has been making adjustments. We believe that with the leadership of the Communist Party of China and cooperation from the Chinese people, our fight against COVID-19 will be successful.
And for more on the significance of these protests, we turn to longtime China watcher Min-Chin Pei, professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. Min-Chin Pei, thanks very much. Welcome back to the NewsHour. How significant do you think these protests are?
These are very significant protests in three respects. First, for the first time, we've seen simultaneous protests in major Chinese cities. The other thing about this round of protests is that participants seem to come from a wide range of social backgrounds, and that has not happened in the last 30 years. And third, and most importantly, some of the demands are explicitly political. We've not heard ordinary people chanting Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to step down. So all these three things make these protests very, very significant.
Because we should note that it's not that protest is unprecedented in China. It is just that most protests we've seen for the last 30 years, and certainly since Xi Jinping took power, have been localized, have been local groups objecting to local policies.
Absolutely. Ordinary protests typically have local issues, socioeconomic issues, and they never spill beyond the boundaries of a county or a small town. But this time, it's very, very different.
We've seen Beijing in recent days take baby steps to ease some of its zero COVID policies. But the message from Xi Jinping himself, elevating people who have enacted the strictest forms of zero COVID, could that message be changed or adjusted at all because of these protests?
I think these protests will force the government, and in particular President Xi Jinping, to adjust his policy, because the message from the protesters is also quite clear. The current situation is not tolerable, and they want the government to change its course.
A Chinese official told me that he feared that if China opened up, more than 1 million people would die. Isn't that fear legitimate, since China's vaccines have been proven to be less effective than Western mRNA vaccines, which are still not allowed in the country?
The honest answer is that nobody knows. Of course, if they open up, there will be a surge in case infections, and also there will likely be a surge of hospitalization, and obviously there will be an increase in the number of deaths. Now you have to sort of balance that against now what appears to be a nationwide demand for the government to change its course. But if I have to guess, I think I'm leaning toward a gradual relaxation rather than doubling down on the policy that seems to be delivering nothing but misery.
Is there any evidence that anyone around Xi Jinping, anyone who has power or influence over him, object to this policy that has been so closely associated with him personally?
No, not at that level. I think at the very top level, President Xi has a group of colleagues that he personally trusts, and those colleagues will back his policy no matter what. I think what the Chinese leadership probably worries a lot more about is local officials, because local officials are on the front line of enforcing zero COVID. And these people are human beings too. So they are tired, they're frustrated, and probably they would like to have a course correction as well.
And zero COVID hasn't only caused social protests, it's depressed growth. China's growing at the second slowest rate in 46 years. What does it say about Xi Jinping that he appears to be prioritizing zero COVID over economic growth?
Well, I think at some point he has to balance zero COVID with economic losses. So if you do a back of the envelope calculation, China has lost about 2% of GDP in terms of growth, and that comes down to about at least $350 billion. So that's a very big number, and that affects employment, that affects government expenditures.
But he has made the decision toward loyalty and toward control over growth in the past, hasn't he?
Oh, yes, but I think when he made those decisions, the economic costs were not that obvious. Today, the costs are undeniable, and these costs are mounting. So as China's leader, now it's his third term, he will not look at what is happening now. He has to look at what is going to happen in the next 5 years. So making a cost shift might be the smartest thing to do than sticking with a very costly policy.
Min-Chin Pei, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, these protesters were calling for the removal of the Communist Party and President Xi. Now that's asking for being shot. That's asking for being executed. That's asking for being killed. By Sunday and early Monday, it expanded, as you would expect, to Beijing. And there's Beijing, and there the students I told you about from the Tsinghua University held very, very large protests on Sunday, and then they assembled at the Siktong Bridge, which is where protesters lit a fire on October 13th, also protesting the COVID lockdown. And then on Sunday also, there were protests in Chengdu, rather, excuse my pronunciation, but I'm doing the best I can, Chengdu, I'll put up a map and show you where that is. There's Chengdu, and that was on Wangping Street. And others, and then people there also found themselves and protesting at the Dongmen Bridge, singing very similar songs. And this is the place where they held up pieces, I'm going to show you that, where they held up pieces of blank paper as a symbol of the censorship in China.
Welcome to the program. We start in China, where the country's strict zero COVID policy is being challenged on an unprecedented scale with a second night of protests in cities across the country. It's being described by some as the white paper or A4 revolution after demonstrators held sheets of blank paper. They're protesting against censorship, and the movement has been building by the day. And while it may have started as an anti-lockdown movement, some of those taking part are now openly calling for the country's leader, Xi Jinping, to stand down, something rarely seen in China. In Shanghai, a long line of blue barriers have been erected along the main protest road. Mass protests have now spread to cities including Wuhan, Nanjing, and the capital, Beijing. From where our China correspondent Stephen McDonnell has the very latest, and a warning, his report does contain some flash photography.
The Chinese capital became the latest city with a demonstration calling for an end to the country's COVID restrictions. The symbol of this movement has become white sheets of paper, with protesters holding them up to represent the way in which people are silenced here by official censorship. They're chanting, saying that strict lockdowns and compulsory testing should stop. But dissatisfaction with the government's handling of this crisis is also spilling over into calls for press freedom and democracy. In the southwestern city of Chengdu, protesters blamed China's leader Xi Jinping personally. They criticised his lifetime leadership entitlement and said their country doesn't need an emperor. This followed earlier calls in Shanghai for Xi Jinping to step down and for the Communist Party to give up power. At the site where protesters clashed with police, barriers have gone up to stop crowds gathering again. Waves of anger have spread across China following an apartment block fire in Xinjiang last week, which killed 10 residents. People have blamed COVID restrictions for hampering the access of firefighters and blocking escape routes. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said foreign forces with ulterior motives had linked the fire to zero COVID measures. But these protests have unleashed discontent, which has been not very far below the surface. A chant can easily become a speech. Freedom! This man said people wanted dignity and the rule of law, and added that he didn't want China's children to go on living in this era of horror.
One of the problems in China is that nobody knows when zero COVID will end. If the government has a plan, it's not told people what it is. And so the belief that this could go on forever is causing a lot of consternation amongst the general public.
Zero COVID in China means trying to return each outbreak to zero infections, using strict stay-at-home orders, travel bans and mass testing. Entire cities are sometimes officially locked down or effectively closed with businesses shut. Yet even with these strict measures, COVID-19 continues to spread. The country posted record new case numbers over the past 5 days in a row. Stephen McDonnell, BBC News, Beijing.
And Hao Jiang is editor of the BBC's Chinese service and joins me live now. And Howard, this has been going on for 3 years, and the patience of the Chinese people has been stretched in that time. And finally now it's been snapped.
It's not even patience. It's just imagine working class people. You have your shop to attend to. You have your small restaurant to run. You have your work factory to go to. If you every once in a while you're told, sorry, you cannot do any of that, who's going to pay them? And the Chinese social welfare system is not as good as this country. In this country, after a few weeks of so-called lockdown, already people are up in arms. And imagine this has been going on for 3 years. So that's the level of discontent, I guess, is so widespread now.
And Howard, we've heard horrific stories come out of China, of what's happened to families, of what's happened to people on buses trying to get to quarantine centres, and of course that fire that took place in Urumqi.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. This is a good part of town and a major apartment building. And the official figure is saying 10 died and maybe another 9 or 10 people got injured, but some locals say the number could be higher. But those are the things we cannot independently verify.
The whole purpose is the same: shut down the opposition. Yep, and they also criminalize the opposition. Very similar. But here you see the people with the white cards. Those white cards were in many ways more powerful than a sign. And what a time to have a protest on censorship, and we're suffering from that here. Don't you? I mean, I feel a real sense of connection with them, since I've personally been censored. I know what it feels like. Gee, maybe I should hold up my white card. Then on Monday, it extended to, let's see, went a little further south, right near Hong Kong, and it extended to Guangzhou. You've heard of Guangzhou. That's a rather famous part of China. It's right, it was the connection of China to Hong Kong before Hong Kong was taken over by China, now completely dominated, and with every single promise that they made of some kind of autonomy for Hong Kong completely rejected. And in Guangzhou, they kept shouting, "Let people go, let people go." And then smaller protests took place in Nanjing, Dali, Changsha, and Xi'an. It's affected almost the entire western end of the country. There may be protests elsewhere. So what has the response been of the totalitarian communist dictators, and in enforcing the law? Well, the police moved in right away in Urumqi, made arrests. In the morning hours of Saturday, at 3 a.m. in the morning, the protests had broken out already in Shanghai, and the police moved in there and moved people out, only to have people return again. Similarly, in Beijing, Nanjing, Guangzhou, and these other places. But the government has not in any way indicated the slightest relaxation of the policies of zero tolerance. So what has happened? We don't know how many people have been killed. Of course, the government puts out a figure like 300. All the human rights groups have it in the 400 to 500s, possibly 600s, and growing. The number of arrests are something like, again, who knows, 18,000 or more. Who knows how accurate that is? And I would say we can be almost certain that we haven't really mapped every area in which these protests have taken place. But they are slaughtering people. People are being shot and killed on the street. Some additional protests have broken out as a result of that. And they're continuing as we speak. The Chinese government shows not the slightest sign of backing down, and the protesters show not the slightest sign of backing down. And the Biden government has given, it would be an exaggeration to say, tepid support to the protesters here or in Iran, because freedom obviously is not a big issue for someone that's taken that much money from a totalitarian, the worst totalitarian regime in the world, or one who participated in giving hundreds of millions to the worst terrorist sponsor of terrorism in the world, Iran. I mean, if there could be a worse time to have a president as compromised as this would be the worst time. Because the question will always be asked, how did we put him there? How did we put him there? What's going to happen in China? Is this a revolution? Or is this just a protest that will be put down? Will there be concessions? Most of the experts make it clear that no one believes there will be a slightest bit of concessions by Xi with regard to the lockdown. Now, they're going to have to stop the lockdown sometime. This probably delays it, but it really isn't about the lockdown. This isn't about the lockdown. The lockdown is a symptom of a totalitarian government. In the United States, the lockdown was the symbol of a government that's moving, because they weren't as extensive as in China, moving toward a totalitarian government, moving toward an authoritarian, moving toward a government like Biden of directive and of dictate. You know, government of dictate is a dictatorship, not a government where you try to pass laws with bipartisan support. A government that accretes tremendous power and money to itself, as Biden has done almost a record since the Second World War. A government that keeps growing, 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 and takes over your personal decisions, like the sexuality of your child, or what pronouns you're going to use and when. That's all signs of a socialist communist government, or one that's moving in that direction. Now, this is a fully accomplished one, socialist or communist government. So you can kind of take a look at it and see if you like it, because this is where the one world of Soros and all these people have us headed, to China dominating the world. So they're going to continue to kill people until they put protests down, and the people are going to continue to protest. So does that make us a revolution? Not yet. Not yet. It's only been a few days, really. It's shown remarkable strength. It's shown remarkable geographic distribution in that period of time. It's gotten remarkably little support from nations that prize liberty, almost none, which is a shame on them. If you're required to respect the leaders of these governments, it's hard. It's hard. It's hard because they seem to have no dedication to liberty. They just seem to have dedication to their own power, and too many of them really to their own wealth, which is getting out of hand now. The amounts of money like the Clintons and the Pelosi's and the Bidens have made because of the influence of public office. It's really at the point of massive scandal, unaddressed by almost equally scandalous press. And this is what happens. These people are under, threat of death when they say get rid of Xi, and the United States can't even make a strong statement of support for them or impose sanctions on China or bring it to the United Nations or try to do something to save their lives. Of course, we've done very little to save the lives of the Uyghurs who are up in that area of China. Are the subject, the UN tells you, of genocide. And what's the UN doing about it? What the UN does about everything. Nothing, except helping China and totalitarian regimes and crooked regimes. So this certainly raises the stakes. It also raises one other question, which is exactly how much did the Chinese communists give the Bidens over the years? We know many of the projects were projects that assisted the military of China, which gets us awfully close to treason. And But we are entitled to know the detail. You are entitled to know the details of it. And the New York Times has no right to keep it from you just because it happens to favor Biden and seems to favor communism in many ways. Certainly isn't tough on China. Nobody is. How could these protests be going on and the world not be outraged? Because China's bought a lot of the world. The NBA is surely not going to say anything, right? They may lose their franchise in China. The gaming industry isn't going to say anything. They make a fortune in China. I might just go on and on. China has done an excellent job of bribing us, of buying our integrity. Haven't bought mine. I bet they haven't bought yours. And maybe, just maybe, this is going to be the turning point. And when you watch what's going on and you watch the spread of it, if I'm back to you in a month or two, and I can say the same thing about China that I'm about to say about Iran, we may be on the road to a revolution, but we're not there yet. We'll be right back. Not long ago, Mike Lindell, the inventor of MyPillow, and his team fit me for my very own MyPillow. They also introduced me to their wide assortment of other incredible products, like their mattress topper, their sheets, towels, slippers, and more. You can get great discounts on MyPillow products by going to mypillow.com right now and seeing each of the specially priced items, including those in the radio listener special square. You're going to see rotational offers up to 66% off on products like their pillows, mattress topper, Giza sheets, but also new products like their slippers, weighted blankets, robes, and waffle blankets. All MyPillow products come with a 60-day money-back guarantee. Enter promo code RUDY for these great specials. That's mypillow.com and use the promo code RUDY. Welcome back to Rudy Giuliani's Common Sense, and we're discussing protest or revolution. Protests or revolution. I think we concluded that in China right now, with less than a week of rather vast protests, at least in a certain half of China, that spread very, very quickly, shows no signs of abating, and is being dealt with extremely violently by the government. It has not been sustained for enough of a period, and the government really hasn't used all of its barbarian power and might that it has brought to bear on prior protests and slaughtering its own people. So it's hard to say yet whether we're at revolution or protest. Now we got a much closer question with Iran. First of all of this goes back to September of this year, which in protest time is pretty good. That's 2.5 months. And I think you remember the protest in China began just last week, and it began with a fire at a house blamed on the COVID restrictions. This began with the arrest in September of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, a young woman who was arrested because she had a slight bit of hair sticking out of her hijab, headdress that women are required to wear in totalitarian Iran, in the regime of terror. I wish you would adopt that name for it, and I wish the Biden people would adopt that name for it. But then there'd be the big question: why did they give hundreds of millions in cash, flown by plane in the middle of the night and kept secret to the Iranian mullahs? Governments don't transact business in cash; they transact business by wire. Governments that give money to terrorists, however, who kill Americans and Israelis, conduct business in cash. So weren't they knowingly giving money that was going to be used to kill Israelis and Americans? That's a question that's never been asked in the censored United States. But there is a moral imperative to raise that question and to answer it if you care about human life. Well, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was held for 2 days by what is known as the morality police in Tehran, and she was taken to a re-education center. and she died there within 2 days, I believe. And a protest broke out immediately. Protests broke out immediately. And now there has been a history of protests in Iran over the last several years. We've reported on it, and we've done podcasts on it, and we've had Ali Reza Jasfadadi on to describe it in great detail, and we'll have him on again because I've had him on my radio show just the other day. He has details we don't have from right inside Iran because he has almost a perfect look at Iran. And I believe we've interviewed Farzin, who's the chief of staff to Madam Rajavi, who is the head of the United Coalition for Iranian Resistance, and also the head of the government in exile that would be capable of running Iran for a period of time to get it to democratic elections. And they are very far along in that process. And they are also very far along in their connections within Iran. Now, it goes beyond even them, but they are the number one group, the Mahajin al-Khalq, that is named by the Ayatollah and by Raisi as the only group capable of really displacing them. And they are on the number one kill list, which has been true. This has been universally true for 40 years, exacerbated now. But these protests go beyond anything in the past. The protests in the past are described as economic grievances. That's 2019 and 2021. They really began even earlier than that, but Trump issued his support for them very, very strongly. And they really affected 180 cities in Iran until the pandemic. And they were beginning to take on the spirit of a revolution because people were being arrested, people were being killed, people were being targeted, and it just continued and continued and continued. And it moved on to different sectors of society. I believe the nurses went on strike, the taxi drivers went on strike, the bus drivers went on strike. And it was economic in the sense that they were decrying the terrible conditions in Iran, which even with the Trump sanctions, is still a rich country, but it gives half of its money to Hamas and Hezbollah and every other group that wants to kill Americans and Israelis. Which is why it's impossible to understand how Biden and Obama gave them millions of dollars in cash, knowing if they kill. I mean, it really was impossible to hear Biden not agree with the elimination of Soleimani, who killed numerous Americans using the Quds Force, universally applauded as the reduction of at least one mad Islamic terrorist. But Biden was against that, like he was against the killing of bin Laden. Do you ever wonder what's wrong with him, Biden? We've asked that question enough times, but the answers are endless, aren't they? Now, the distinction made by The Guardian, which never really understood the original protest, says these are different because they are now seeking political change. I looked at hundreds of film and pictures of the earlier protests, and all of them call for political change. These are not the first protests calling for political change. Protests go back to 2014 asking for political change, and Obama turned his back on them with 2012 or whenever that was. So this is just, typical left-wing reporting that somehow I think kind of likes Iran, even though next to China, they kill more of their own people than any country on earth. This is the first time there have been protests of this dimension. There were protests of this dimension in 2019 and 2020, ignored largely by the press and discounted, as is the Mujahideen al-Khalq, who were seen as not capable of prevailing and also not capable of governing. That's what the New York Times, people who live in an ivory tower who have been wrong about everything, say. Meanwhile, the Ayatollah and Raisi and the people fighting for their dictatorship fear the Mujahideen al-Khalq more than any other group. I would go with their analysis rather than the pinheads. and who have been wrong about everything, and also sometimes seem to have a desire to hurt our country. But there is no doubt there is an intensity to this one that is very powerful.
The government is still trying to crack down. It has confirmed the first death sentence for a protester, someone accused of setting fire to a government building. The charge, enmity against God. Charlie Daggett is following the latest protests, including a series of walkouts that began this morning.
Defying the threat of execution, they're still demonstrating on the streets of Iran. This was last Friday. Iran's revolutionary court handed down the first official death sentence to an anti-government protester on Sunday. An ominous warning for more than 15,000 Iranians currently under arrest. The Iranian regime said the rebels need to be taught a hard lesson. It follows a brutal crackdown on demonstrations that have raged for months, triggered by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in September, allegedly beaten while in custody of so-called morality police, accused of wearing her headscarf improperly. It became a flashpoint that erupted into nationwide protests. Chants of death to the dictator on a scale Iran has not seen in decades, burning their hijabs and chopping off their hair in defiance. Activists believe there is little hope of a fair trial for the thousands detained, now awaiting sentencing.
Human rights groups fear that a wave of execution orders may now follow, yet even in the face of death sentences, activists have called on Iranians to take part in 3 days of nationwide protests starting today.
But now it has taken on a dimension and an imperative that does seem stronger with the killing of Amini. And also, unlike the protest in China, which is just getting started, this has been going on for a year and a half, and it follows up for a month and 2.5 months, and it follows a year and a half of protests that had been cut off. So it's like picking the gauntlet up again, this time with more fervor. And it does not seem to be lessening. It's moving all throughout the country. So this has spread very, very fast. It's amassed younger people. They are asking directly for political change. They are going right at the Ayatollah, the mullahs, accusing them of being dictators, murderers, and thieves. They're going right at Raisi. And all the experts expect this to continue to escalate, despite the fact that brute force is being used. And where does it end? Well, as one expert said, the government has far more capacity for repression than it does for reform. A scrapping of the hijab law is very unlikely. And this, the Chinese could lessen the COVID lockdown easily in light of present science. And it's not something they have to maintain. This is something that will remain as long as it remains a religiously extremist regime, this hijab law. The chances of their backing down or even modifying it are very, very small. So now we have a protest that looks like it's not going to end, and a regime that's not going to concede. I think that has you at revolution, because the protest is seeking an overthrow of the government, plain and simple. And you could, you're not positive, it still needs more time, but it's beginning to have the feeling this doesn't end until the Ayatollah, the mullahs are gone. Now, you should know the mullahs are a bunch of mafia gangsters. They're not religious leaders. And the Ayatollah is a very rich man who is a thief, as well as a liar and a pathological murderer. And Biden and Obama's love of this country and their desire to suck up to them in order to reach this nuclear agreement that would just not only make them a nuclear power, but also make them very rich, is disgusting. It's one of the reasons that makes one wonder why the hell did you elect them. So this has gone on in the Capitol. It's gone on in something like already 60 or 70 cities. So the earlier ones went to 195, and they probably have protests. We just don't know about it. The death toll is about 500. In the 2019 protest, it was 1,500, according to the government. So it is obviously, whatever it is, it's higher than they're saying. And Iran has taken the position it's not going to cooperate with the UN or anyone else. And the people are making no concessions and continue to escalate the protests, which are now at the stage of a revolution. Their chance of putting it down for a while exists. Their chance of wiping it out for good, like, Russia, Soviet Union, and Communist Poland put down solidarity for a while, but it just grew and grew and grew and took over. I think we have a solidarity here. And we have a Mujahideen al-Khalq that is the strength behind all of this. There is an excellent article, very short, in the New York Post. It would be the November 28th edition by Maryam Rajavi. Maryam Rajavi, for decades, has been the head of Mujahideen al-Khalq. And it is dedicated to a free, non-nuclear, peaceful Iran. And she wrote an op-ed piece describing that, not describing some of the other wonderful things they can do, like lead a transition to a free government, a government that treats women fairly. The leadership of Mujahideen al-Khalq, of which I am very familiar, I've spent an enormous amount of time with them and have done very good work. I spent an enormous amount of time with them and done very good work with them, is at least half women, including the fighters. This is a group that is exactly a mirror image of our values, at least our values, not the sick, perverted values that the progressives have begun to introduce in the United States to destroy our values, but our values that stem from our founding fathers and those who led this country and created the last beacon of freedom in the world. They're right on target with us. Election of leaders, a country that has laws that are followed, a country in which corruption is eliminated, a country that will be non-nuclear, and a country that will give freedom of religion and freedom to women for full participation, exemplified by the full participation of women in the Mujahideen al-Khalq. So there you go. Read this article, and I think you'll see that one of the other things that The Guardian misses, because it's a left-wing rag, is there's no leadership for this. Oh, my goodness. I've been at so many meetings in which I've talked directly into Iran with the help of Mujahideen al-Khalq. They don't know what they're talking about. And they're going to wake up one day and the mullahs are going to be gone, the Ayatollah is going to be gone, and we're going to do what we promised after our yearly meeting now for the last decade plus two, several of which were almost bombed by Iranians who have been since prosecuted for it, who would have killed us. Newt Gingrich, Maryam Rajavi, Farzin Ali, all the people involved in this movement at a top level have several times been realistically threatened with death. And this is so important because they're right on the verge. I will make a bold statement. If we didn't have Biden in the White House, who has a sick connection to Iran through the money they gave them, and this would happen with an American president like a Reagan or a Trump. And I don't mean we would send troops in. very strong moral support would do it. They have got the capacity to accomplish this. This is a revolution. It's going to be won. The question is now or later. Now means less loss of life. Later means a lot more. The only reason it'll be later is because we have a pathetic coward in the White House who has a strange fascination with Iran. I know what it is with China, money. I do not know what it is with Iran. But we're going to stay on top of this, and they may prevail without him. This protest in Iran is much further along than in China. So let's conclude this way. We asked the question at the beginning, protest or revolution? Right now, China, protests, dangerous ones for the regime. Iran, protests, very dangerous ones, building on years of protest. They haven't had protests yet in cities where they had big protests 2 years ago. They're still coming. I think we could say revolution. The only sadness is, where are we? Where's our country? The beacon of freedom in the world, Iran, a country that kidnapped Americans, that killed American soldiers, that intervened in Iraq so they could kill Americans, a country that teaches its children to kill Jews, to kill Israelis, to destroy Israel, and to kill Americans. And we're quiet? There's something seriously wrong in the present White House. Need I say it over and over again? Seriously wrong. They objected to America first. I never expected America last. You stay on top of this. This may happen to spite them. And wouldn't that be a glorious victory for freedom? God bless America.